How's it going, everybody? Too Spooky here. It's pretty much a universal experience in growing up that all of us were subjected to at least one movie or TV show that absolutely terrified us as a child. It could have been something seemingly normal and otherwise kid-friendly, or something that was actually intended to be scary. But regardless of the context, all of us have those pieces of media that kept us up at night and left us with a lasting impression of lingering fear and trauma to this very day. Back in 2016 and 2017, YouTuber YMS, or Your Movie Sucks, had a 4-part video series going over some of the movies and TV shows that traumatized them as a child, also getting various other YouTubers to make videos detailing their own experiences of childhood trauma thanks to the various pieces of media they experienced at a young age, like Chris Stuckman, I Hate Everything, and many more. When those videos were initially coming out, I took the time to think back to the movies and shows that deeply horrified me as a kid, and knew I needed to revisit them with a video of my own and finally face those fears. I've always really loved scary media, and to this day horror is one of my all-time favorite genres. In fact, as an adult, I'm usually very impressed with any movies or shows that can actually scare me to any capacity, because it takes a lot to actually scare me these days. So taking a deep dive back into some repressed memories of what once scared me the most sounds like a blast. Needless to say, I'm a little late to this trend, now that I'm finally getting to it almost 8 years later, but here are some of the movies and shows that deeply traumatized me as a child. But before we jump into it, this video is sponsored by World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play game on PC where you transverse the seas with all of history's most iconic battleships, submarines, and more to conquer the oceans against enemies and allies alike in various PvP or PvE scenarios. With over 600 ships from 10 nations to command, 40 incredibly realistic maps to explore, insanely detailed dynamic weather graphics to always keep you on your toes, and new content released every month, with popular collaborations like Azure Lane, Transformers, and Megadeth, there is endless content for you to experience. With the game also now being available on consoles as well, you don't want to miss out. Follow my special link in the description to download World of Warships now. And when you do, make sure to use promo code BRAVO to receive a massive starter pack, including 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, and a ship. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring the video, and I hope to see you on the seas. While I don't really know the exact age I first experienced any of the media I'm about to mention, I know for a fact I watched all of them between the ages of 5 and 10. That said, I figure we should start with the earliest media-related trauma I can recall, which was actually thanks to Peewees Big Adventure, of all things. For those who don't know, Pee Wee Herman is a character played by Paul Reubens, and has been the titular character of multiple shows and movies. If you've never experienced Pee Wee Herman before, it's a bit hard to describe the character, but they're basically an over-the-top flamboyant man-child.
I know you are, but what am I?
Pee Wee Herman was actually a bigger part of my childhood than you'd probably expect, because my dad was a big fan of the character, and could do an insanely accurate voice impression. So whether it was watching this movie, Pee-wee's Playhouse, or listening to my dad crack jokes in Pee-wee's voice, the character was always around to some capacity. When it comes to Pee-wee's Big Adventure, the basic plot surrounds Pee-wee embarking on a quest across the nation to recover his stolen bike, which gets him into plenty of hijinks along the way. So by now you might be thinking, it's a PG movie about a goofy fella trying to get his bike back? What could possibly be so scary about that? Well, Pee-wee visits a fortune teller who scams him into thinking that his bike is held at the Alamo in Texas. So he ends up hitchhiking with an escaped convict named Mickey. In the middle of the night, while Mickey is trying to sleep, Pee-wee drives the car off a cliff. So upon narrowly surviving that, Mickey kicks him out on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere. In a seemingly hopeless situation, some headlights suddenly illuminate Pee-wee out of the darkness, to which a burly older woman picks him up in her semi. Pee-wee thanks her for the lift, but the woman proceeds to ignore his gratitude and instead tell him a cryptic tale about the worst wreck she's ever seen.
On this very night, 10 years ago, I saw the worst accident I ever seen. There was this sound, like a garbage truck dropped off the Empire State Building. And when they finally pulled the driver's body from the twisted, burning wreck, it looked like this.
That face is what haunted me as a child. As an adult, it certainly seems really goofy, but something about the exaggerated features accompanied with the jolting sounds for the jump scare instilled me with pure terror. Top that off with the reveal that she's been dead for 10 years as her ominous laugh fades the scene to black. And this might have just been my first core memory with the concept of ghosts and the afterlife. That face and laugh certainly kept my child brain busy for many a nights. Revisiting the film as an adult too, the whole thing is actually a lot more terrifying than I remember. First off, I didn't know this was actually Tim Burton's feature-length directorial debut, so that explains a lot. But there's a lot of surreal imagery with horrific clowns and dream sequences throughout the entire thing. And Pee-wee himself is the most terrifying aspect of all, because this dude is an actual psychopath.
There's a lot of things about me you don't know anything about, Daddy. Things you wouldn't understand. Things you couldn't understand. Things you shouldn't understand.
Go ahead and scream your head off! We're miles from where anyone can hear you!
You don't want to get mixed up with a guy like me. I'm a loner, Daddy. A rebel.
I simply am not there.
All I know is that meeting Pee-wee in real life would probably be my worst nightmare. But as a child, Large Marge is the only thing in this movie that actually scared me. If you haven't seen Pee-wee's Big Adventure, it still holds up pretty well and it's actually quite funny, so give this one a watch. Next up is a movie I definitely should not have been allowed to watch as a kid, 1988's The Blob. A movie about a slime-like organism that crash lands near a small town via meteorite and begins consuming everything in its path, growing bigger with everything it devours. This just happened to be something my dad was watching on cable TV at the time, and although he was hesitant to let me watch it, he did let me see a few scenes. What I specifically remember seeing before my dad turned it off was a scene in a local diner where the Blob sucks an employee into a sink drain before overflowing onto the ceiling and chasing our protagonists into a freezer. The sight of this poor guy's hands and feet suspended above the sink as he was mercilessly sucked down the drain certainly left a lasting impression on me, and made me scared to ever stick my fingers down a drain. Even today, whenever I'm cleaning my sink, I hesitate to scrub the drain thinking about some sort of unseen creature pulling me down inside. But the thing is, I also had this extremely vivid memory of the Blob coming through a bathtub faucet, and a woman running out of the room as the Blob covers the entire bathtub. Because as a child, bath time was a common occurrence for me, and the idea of the Blob coming through the faucet while I was playing in the water absolutely horrified me. Especially because at the time, my parents also had me use this weird floating sponge thing for me to sit on in the bath, and I specifically remember seeing the Blob consuming one of these bath sponges that I was all too familiar with, making the idea of the Blob getting me in the bath seem that much more possible, and real for that matter. But once I revisited the Blob for the first time as a teenager with no fear, this scene that I remembered so vividly wasn't present. So I just figured I must have made up the entire scene in my overimaginative child brain. Or maybe it was some sort of deleted scene that they added to the TV showing of the film. I have no idea. Either way, while this was such a core memory for me, it wasn't there. But, as it turns out, I didn't actually imagine this scene after all. It was real. However, it wasn't from the Blob at all. It was from a completely separate movie. A few years back, I was watching Ghostbusters II, while not remembering a single thing about it. And lo and behold, the scene that haunted my bath time for years was from this movie, as this pink slime, that's like an amalgamation of people's negative emotions, is a focal point of the film. So I don't know how I mixed this up. I'm guessing that I saw the Blob on TV, and then soon after, this scene from Ghostbusters 2 must have also been playing on TV around the same time, and my brain just thought that this pink goo had to have been the Blob once again. Which, looking into it further, unused footage from the Blob was actually used in Ghostbusters 2. So in retrospect, thinking these two movies were one and the same would be such an easy thing to do as an idiotic child who doesn't know any better. So while the Blob haunted child me for years, it turns out it wasn't specifically just the Blob, but also the pink slime from Ghostbusters 2. Needless to say, making that discovery as an adult was a very healing experience, because I thought it was just a crazy thing I imagined all those years ago. On that note, The Blob is also an incredibly underrated horror movie. You should definitely check it out. Speaking of pieces of media I thought I imagined, next up is The Faculty. which is basically an Invasion of the Body Snatchers typed movie where aliens start taking over the bodies of various faculty, staff, and students in a small town. I specifically have vivid memories of catching the final act of this movie on TV while I was completely unsupervised. I don't know where my dad was at the time, but they left the Sci-Fi Channel or something on before leaving the room, and this movie just happened to be playing. What I witnessed was the alien queen chasing a student, who I now know was Elijah Wood, around a pool, before they eventually corner each other while running throughout the school. The queen coughs a bunch of these little alien tadpole things into his skin, and they start wiggling around his face, before he defeats the queen with the power of drugs, and all the little aliens fall to the floor dead as a result. This really freaked me out as a child, because I was already very weirded out at the idea of little creatures getting under my skin because of the beetles from The Mummy, so suddenly the idea of these other worm-looking creatures being able to enter my face was absolutely horrifying. Top that off with an insanely scary alien queen design that can glide underwater with like little effort, and I was actually scared to swim in a pool for a while. But unlike everything else in this video so far, I had no idea what I just watched, but I would vividly remember that scene for the rest of my life. It wouldn't be until I was exploring everything the horror genre had to offer as an adult that I eventually came across this movie again, and realized that this was the film that plagued my memory for all those years. If you haven't seen this one, it's actually really underrated with an all-star cast. Like, it was directed by Robert Rodriguez and stars a ton of well-known actors like Elijah Wood, Clea Duvall, Famke Janssen, Robert Patrick, Jon Stewart of all people, and so many more. If you're a fan of horror and movies from the 90s in general, this is a real gem. Following the running theme of random scenes I saw on TV that would haunt me until I rediscovered what they were from years later, we have The Matrix. But probably not for the reason you'd think. It has nothing to do with what The Matrix is actually about. In fact, I only saw a single scene from this movie as a child, and that single scene is what scared Lil Baby Spooky beyond belief. Like I mentioned with The Faculty and The Mummy, I absolutely could not stand the idea of creatures entering my body. And truth be told, the idea still freaks me out now. So you can imagine just how detrimental that concept was for me when I barely understood the creatures of the world. But my dad and my stepmother were watching The Matrix on TV, and the scene that was playing was the one where the agents hold down Neo and let a little tracker robot bug thing enter his belly button. And when little me got terrified at what I just witnessed, I asked my dad what it was, and he said it was a real thing called a belly bug. So thanks for that one, Dad. But because of that, I was scared that a giant bug was going to enter my belly button while I was sleeping for years. Like the previous two films, it wouldn't be until I was revisiting The Matrix as an adult that I would suddenly get hit with deja vu at the belly bug scene, and realize this was one of the pieces of media that deeply traumatized me as a kid. Next up is an episode of a TV show that traumatized a ton of kids from my generation, that being an episode of Goosebumps. Like many kids from the 90s, I had a ton of the books, and overall I just thought Goosebumps was so cool. Nobody did children's horror like Goosebumps did back in the day. My first experience with it was during this weird time of my early childhood where my mother was living with my aunt, and whenever we would go to stay there wasn't a whole lot for us to do, because my cousins were so much older than my brother and I, and they didn't really want anything to do with us. But one thing we did get to do was watch some of their various VHS tapes, and I distinctly remember they had 4 episodes of Goosebumps on VHS, those being A Night in Terror Tower, Stay Out of the Basement, Night of the Living Dummy, and the one that by far scared me the most, The Haunted Mask. See, I would watch these episodes pretty much every time I was over there. I was obsessed with them. But even though I didn't particularly like being scared, the ending of The Haunted Mask always got to me. For those who don't know, The Haunted Mask is a story about a girl named Carly Beth, who gets scared very easily from pretty much everything. So out of frustration with herself, she decides this Halloween she wants to be the one doing the scaring for a change. Upon going to a strange new shop in town to get a scary costume, she comes across a set of terrifying masks in the back room of the shop that the shopkeeper says aren't for sale because they're simply too scary. In reality, bro is the scary one. Maybe take a step back there, bucko. For sale or not, Carly Beth takes one of the masks because she's determined to finally get even with the bullies who scare her all the time. But upon putting on the mask, Carly Beth essentially becomes an entirely different person, because as it turns out, the mask was taking over.
No one cared who I was till I put on the mask.
The two things that scared me the most about this was that throughout the entire episode, Carly Beth is carrying around this plaster head of herself, which starts talking and moving at various points. And I think it's just that uncanny valley effect in hindsight, but with how unnatural it looks, child me just couldn't help but get freaked out by it whenever it was on screen. And the other thing that terrified me were the other masks in the final act of this episode. After finding out that Carly Beth can't take off the mask because it essentially became her, she makes her way back to the shop where she originally took it from, where the shopkeeper reveals that she can't take it off because she's wearing a real face. Through a fit of frustration at her newfound appearance, the other masks wake up and start floating towards her. And the way these masks move is what scared the fuck out of me. They essentially glide through the air with this delayed frame effect, and it just looks so unsettling. The mere idea of a bunch of scary heads just chasing you around as they unnaturally glide through the air was so unnerving to me as a child that it kept me up on numerous occasions. And for a small period of time after this, I remember being afraid of putting on any Halloween masks out of fear that it might get stuck to my face. While in hindsight, it's just a goofy episode for kids about loving yourself, it sure freaked me out at the time. Now for the final piece of media trauma I experienced as a child, this is the only one that I have never revisited, because it was the piece of media that scared me most of all, and to this day, I still get a little uncomfortable when I see anything relating to it. Well, that is, I've never revisited it until it came time to make this video and face my fear. The media that scared little child Spooky the most was an episode of the crime drama CSI. Now, it's pretty obvious to anyone who knows anything about the show CSI that I absolutely should not have been watching that as a child, as it involves numerous acts of crime, violence, you name it. But as a child, whenever I'd be visiting my mother, she would always have some random show she liked playing on the TV in the background, such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Criminal Minds, Bones, and of course, CSI, to name a few. Generally speaking, I didn't pay much attention to what was happening in any of these shows, but I would occasionally glance up or watch a couple scenes from time to time while I was playing RuneScape or messing around online unsupervised. But late one night, soon after my mother had moved into this new apartment, making me about 7 years old at the time, she was getting us ready for bed but was watching the newest episode of CSI before calling it a night. This episode was called The Finger. The basic plot of the episode being that a guy walks into a bank and withdraws $1 million from his account, with traces of blood on his hands. After detaining the man out of suspicion, the CSI crew comes in to grab some evidence, before the man's lawyer shows up and gets him out of there. He accidentally leaves his sunglasses behind, so one of the main characters, Catherine, brings them out to him, which is when the man gets a mysterious phone call that ends up getting Catherine wrapped up into a kidnapping blackmail scheme. The two of them eventually meet the kidnapper on some back road off the highway, which is where we get to the scene that's haunted me for years. I specifically remember the silhouette of someone huffing something under the guise of bright headlights, before that silhouette walks forward and turns out to be someone in a rabbit mask, who asks for the briefcase full of money in a very high-pitched voice.
The briefcase.
I remember screaming and crying and jumping in my mom's arms begging her to turn off the TV because it was just too scary. Watching it now, it's really not scary at all. It's literally just a guy in a trench coat with a rabbit mask who huffed some helium to make their voice high. I have no idea why it scared me so much, but I'm guessing it had something to do with the fact that the mask and unnatural voice combination gave me some sort of fight or flight response that made every ounce of my body scream because of the uncanny valley effect. It was just something so inhuman to me, and the added inhuman voice was just too much for Lil Spooky to handle. Because of that scene, I was always on edge around any sort of rabbit or bunny costumes just because I would always remember that scene and how scared it made me feel. Finally facing that fear in this video and seeing that it was nowhere near as scary as I remember has truly been a healing experience, so I'm really glad I did this today. And with that, if you guys enjoyed this one, be sure to leave a like. And while you're at it, comment below which pieces of media scared you guys as kids. I'd love to hear any stories you guys might have surrounding that. On that note, if there are any other YouTubers out there who thought this was a fun idea, I implore you to make a video of your own going over your own experiences with the media that traumatized you as kids. I've got a lot of videos cooking in the background currently, one project of which is going to end up being a minimum of 6 hours long, so be sure to hit that subscribe button for more content on the way. While you're at it, all of my social media is in the description below, and you can also follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/2spookster to hang out with me during some streams. Once again, thank you to World of Warships for making this video possible. Be sure to download the game with the link in the description and use code BRAVO to receive that massive starter pack. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all soon with the next video.
Why